Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the church and scripture in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. Christianity was a text-based religion. Pagan religions simply were not. Most of the pagan religions didn't care what you believed. They didn't necessarily, they might have had a system of belief, but it wasn't written into a specific book. It was more based upon what you did. Did you offer the right incense in the temple? Did you say a prayer? Did you do some sort of ritual? So that there were sacrifices, there were prayers. Belief was not considered to be all that important. And therefore, texts were not all that important. After all, writing it was an expensive proposition back then. You had to have the ink, you had to have the writing utensil, and especially you had to have some sort of thing, some sort of product on which the writing was to be protected, whether papyri or vellum, and all of those things were labor intensive and very expensive. Judaism was the sole exception to this rule. Of course, you had the Old Testament scriptures, and that's what we're going to be focused on primarily this time. We'll come back next time to talk about the New Testament. Christianity then was built upon Judaism's text-based faith, and it would capture that, and indeed, I would suggest that it would even build upon it. Now, there's this interesting word. I'm giving it to you in Greek, the Greek word canon. Although when you go to the Hebrew language, and this is very rare because Greek and Hebrew are two totally different languages. They have almost no words in common except this word, canon. A canon was a ruler, a straight edge. It had to be unbendable. It had to be dependable as to its straightness, just like when you're trying to draw a straight line with a ruler. Galatians chapter 6, verse 16 uses the Greek term, like I said, the Hebrew has exactly the same term. Those who walk by this rule, this canon, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. Now, the part that I'm looking at is the use of this word, this rule, so that the ruler of a canon could be something that you were talking about physically for building purposes or measuring purposes, or the same term could be used in a more figurative sense, a rule of life. And we're going to use that term, canon or a canon, to speak of the canon of Scripture. Now, canonicity is the process by which the books of the Bible were gathered and collected so that they came to be regarded as the standard and norm, that is, the rule for Christians. The important thing to see here is that canonicity refers to the recognition of the authority of the inspired writings. What makes a book inspired? Well, what makes a book inspired is that God inspired it. What makes the book a book of the Bible inspired? God's Spirit gave it. But in canonicity, we ask the question: how do we, as believers, recognize which books that God inspired? And that's an entirely different question. So here's some of the questions that we deal with when we come to the subject of canonicity. First of all, how are we to determine if we have the right books in the Bible? We have in our English Bible, Protestant English Bible, 66 books. Our Roman Catholic friends have some additional books. Our Jewish friends have a few or less. They would recognize only what we call our Old Testament. What about the Apocrypha? That those books that our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox friends have in their Bible. They're not necessarily bad books. We're going to talk about them, but should they be in our Bibles as well? Are there certain books that in our Bible that should not be there? And the church wrestled with that question. We're going to see more on that next time. The wrestling of the church with the books of the New Testament, and even there were times where some of the Jewish people looked at a few of the older books of the Older Testament, and they said, "Well, wait a minute. There's a few books that are a little hard to understand. What about Song of Solomon, or what about Ecclesiastes? That's a rather difficult book." Are we missing some books? Are there some books that we should have that we do not have? Now, with regard to the church, in our timeline, we've looked at the ancient church and the medieval church and the Reformed church, and we're going to be seeing that the New Testament is written during the first century, but it comes to be recognized, not all of it immediately. There's a process. Some of the books very early on are going to be recognized as authoritative. And then there will be a few books where it's going to take a bit longer. Um, but what we want to look at first is this question of canonicity as it relates to the Old Testament. And here we have a number of threads that come together. First of all, the testimony of Jesus. Jesus said to his hearers, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you." This is Luke chapter 24 when he is speaking to two of his disciples on the Emmaus Road. "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all the things which are written about me," and notice the designation that he does, "the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Three sort of designations: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, the Jews understood, in fact, even today, they will refer to the Tanakh, and that's a shorthand for Torah, Naviim, and Ketuvim. Torah stands for the law. Naviim is the Hebrew word for the prophets, and the Ketuvim are the writings of which the Psalms stands in first place. And so it sounds like Jesus is referring to the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, here as he speaks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. We have not only the testimony of Jesus, but we have the testimony of the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is the very first translation ever made of the Hebrew Old Testament, and it was a translation made into Greek. Way back in the 200s BC, you have in Alexandria, Egypt, a translation made of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, sponsored by the king of Egypt. His name was Ptolemy. His father had been named Ptolemy. All the sons and grandsons and great grandsons are going to be named Ptolemy as well. These were descendants of one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and so a whole line of Greek kings ruling from Alexandria, ruling over Egypt. And tradition has it that this is Ptolemy II, who mentions that he was building a great library in Alexandria, and he wanted to have all of the books in the world. And one of the books in the world that he wanted in his library was the Hebrew Scriptures, but he couldn't read Hebrew. So he commissioned it supposedly to be translated into Greek. And tradition has it that for his great library, he had 70 Hebrew scholars, 70 Hebrew scribes working on this translation, and that's why they called it the Septuagint. The word Septuagint just means the 70, and so the 70 scholars were working on this particular translation. You can go to Alexandria today, and the library that then has long since been destroyed. There's a brand new library, probably not exactly on the same site, but Alexandria is still a city today. And so the tradition has it that there were 70 scholars. They eventually translated the entire Old Testament. I'm not sure if they did it all in one sitting, although tradition has it that they worked independently, and out came, and they all agreed. They all agreed perfectly. I think that's probably uh, perhaps a little fanciful on that regard, but I'm sure that they had a number of translators working on it, and they also translated what we call the Old Testament, but eventually, not that year because all of it hadn't been written yet, but eventually the Apocrypha was also included and translated as as part of this translation. And so when we come to copies of the Septuagint, very oftentimes they will have what we think of the Old Testament, but then they will also have the apocryphal writings, which were written later. Next, we have the testimony of the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is full of quotations from the Old Testament. You can hardly read through almost any New Testament book without seeing direct quotations. Sometimes they are merely allusions. Sometimes I like the way Matthew often does this, where he'll give a quote, but then you're supposed to know what is in the context of that quote, because it will be part of the bigger message. He sort of gives you a hint to begin you off, but then you need to know the rest of it. But there's not a single direct quotation from the Apocrypha, notably absent from the New Testament. Next, we have the testimony of Josephus, and this is where I usually turn to, because Josephus is telling us not what his opinions are, but what are the opinions of the Jewish people living in the first century. He says in his writing Contra Appian, he's writing to this person named Appian, who said some nasty things about the Jewish people. He says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books." Now you say, wait a minute, I thought there were 39 books in the Old Testament. He's counting them differently. For example, when you come to the minor prophets, there's 12 minor prophets. The Jewish people, just even to this day in their Tanakh, in their Hebrew Bible, they will count that as one book, and it's called the 12. And so it's understood there's 12 books within there. Or First and Second Kings, or First and Second Samuel, or First and Second Chronicles. Those are counted as one. And then Ezra and Nehemiah are put together as one book. So it's the same books. But only 22 books, he says, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. In other words, these are from God. He continues, "It is true our history has been written since Artaxerxes." Now he's speaking of those other books, books like the books that are in the Apocrypha, very particularly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. Notice he says the Old Testament scriptures, they were from God, but then the prophets stopped, and there hasn't been a regular succession of prophets. And so these other books, they didn't come to us from prophets, and so therefore they don't have the same authority. And that's, I think, a good way of looking at the distinction between the Old Testament versus the Apocrypha. It's not that they're bad books. Some of them contain some good history, like the book of Maccabees. It's actually two books of First and Second Maccabees are both historical. Third and fourth, not so much. But worthy of reading. But we're going to see the church decided we won't read those from the pulpit. We'll read them, but not from the pulpit. And so we have the testimony of Josephus, but next we have the testimony of the Apocrypha itself. You see, the Apocrypha, the term there means hidden away from. The apo is from, and a cipher is something that's hidden. The Apocrypha speaks of the division of the scriptures into the law and the prophets. We have this several places, both in the prologue of Syriac and a few places in Second Maccabees and also in Fourth Maccabees. And it's not a term that they use for their own writings, but it's a term that they use for the writings that already existed. So they're bearing testimony to the earlier work of scriptures. And you don't find the Old Testament mentioning this division. There's nowhere in the Old Testament where it talks about the law and the prophets. That's only something you could talk about once the law and the prophets had been completed, had been written. Now here are the books, First and Second Esdras. Now it sounds like Ezra, and the names are the same, but it's actually additions to that. Tobit and Judith are sort of, I think of them as ancient historical fiction. There's a sequel to Esther, Wisdom of Solomon or Wise Sayings. Sirach is a book of wisdom literature, sort of like the Proverbs. Baruch, additions to Daniel, just some additional stories told there. Susanna and Bel and the Dragon, likewise, I would tend to put those also in that place of historical fiction. And then First and Second Maccabees, which gives us, I think, some important history, and so is worthy of some reading and understanding and some study. And this means that the church was born with a completed canon in her hands, the canon of what we call the Old Testament. But, as we'll see next time, we have added to that now with the writings of the apostles and their deputies. And that's going to be the story of the New Testament canon.